Welcome back to Highly Respected. I'm your host, Scott Greer. It's once again a wonderful Monday and another wonderful episode ahead of you. So sit back and enjoy this episode. We've got a lot to cover, and once again, it is a breaking news story a continuing news story that things can change later in the week. And of course, I'm talking about the Kyle Rittenhouse trial. That's going to be one of the main focuses for this week of what the podcast is talking about. And the verdict is not going to be reached today, or hopefully not. Hopefully it's not like at 5:30 and then they reach their verdict when this after it's been recorded. It's likely to be later this week. So we'll have an IQ supplement on the verdict and what that means later this week. But we'll talk about what the trial's been like so far, its meanings, its connections to other trials, and just various things that are happening in America that relate to what's going on with Rittenhouse. Of course, if anybody has been watching the trial, I assume most of my listeners have been paying attention somewhat to the trial. It's been a disaster for the prosecution so far. Pretty much every witness, even their own witnesses, came up and hurt their own story. You know, they tried to paint this picture that Kyle Rittenhouse was some vigilante and attacked innocent people. Turns out all three of the people who were shot by him attacked him. They got it on video. They even got the Gage Grosskreutz, who is the last living victim of Rittenhouse, to admit that he had a gun pointing at Rittenhouse when he was fired upon. And even though the news media said he was pointing in the air, or he was not pointing his gun, or even he went on news networks and claimed he had his hands in the air, which contradicted his sworn court testimony. So, and everyone in court could see at the moment that he had his gun pointed at Rittenhouse. Not directly at Rittenhouse, but in the direction of Rittenhouse's head, as he tried to claim on the stand. So it's not been going well for the prosecution at all. Even when Rittenhouse testified, it didn't go that well for him, even though some people were worried and that said that his emotional sobs and other things would have been bad, but he did usually perform well, and the prosecution just came off as dickheads who were going after an underage minor and he's not a minor anymore, but going after a kid on the witness stand. And it's not been going well for them at all. I mean, this trial has been a farce from day one, even when they had these charges, and the fact that they had pronounced Rittenhouse guilty upon this story first breaking. I think, social media censored people. It still censors people for what they say about the Kyle Rittenhouse, or saying anything about his innocence, or what your thoughts on the trial are. They always censor this. And this is carried on even today when we're seeing in the trial, and we're seeing a much different picture. But now, is he still going to get or not get away? That's not the word. Is he still going to be exonerated? Is he still going to be acquitted? That is the question of how much we put a trust in our justice system and the jury, or whether they've already made up their own minds. Because this really does depend not on whether you're looking at the facts. It just depends on what your opinion of this is. And it does. I mean, the news media is still wanting to convict this kid. They're still trying to claim he's guilty. They, forget facts. They ignore certain factors of the trial. Even how they've portrayed Gage Grosskreutz and others in the thing, and they'll forget important details that are much more in Rittenhouse's favor. They all ignore that. None of that really matters. What's really important is convicting this kid, and they still will find, as the incident where Grosskreutz has his gun pointed at Rittenhouse, they say it was pointed at the air. The air. There was some object in between Rittenhouse and Grosskreutz. There must have been a fly that he was pointing the gun at. But that's what they've been claiming. So, and even if you've not been watching the court trial or not been on Twitter, you may still think that Rittenhouse is guilty, depending on what news you're watching. I mean, they're still insisting on this kid's guilt. There are major celebrities making fun of him for crying on the stand, such as LeBron James, and they're all saying you're guilty. And so they want this verdict, and they've been pushing for this verdict. And whether this has an impact on the jury, we still think of there's still this idiotic notion of impartiality that we still adhere to. People will have their own biases going in, and they're like, no, these people are willing to be put those aside and be objective. It's the same with like in the George Floyd trial against Derek Chauvin. There's a guy who's a BLM activist, full-on BLM activist, who lied about that when he was in jury selection. He was put on the jury. And he still insists that, like, oh, I was able to put that aside to be objective. And the media's like, oh, of course. Once you become a juror, you're just totally objective and impartial. Like, you put aside your biases. Unless you have opinions we don't like, or you're white. We can't trust you. But if you're like a BLM activist or an Antifa, like, of course you can put aside your prejudices and be objective and impartial. And this is how we operate in this country too much. And even like that, in the jury selection, there was all these conservatives who were self-selecting them out of the pool by simply saying like, oh, I'm biased. I support the Second Amendment, or I have law enforcement relatives. They were like this, and it's like the left is not doing this. The left will like, this person can be an open Antifa militant, and they'll hide that. They will not like say, oh, I actually participated in the Kenosha riot, or I was one of the, there's like, those people would just not say that. They're like, oh, and I can be objective. And the media and the larger society is going to delude themselves into believing that these people are objective. So it remains to see, and the jury is not sequestered. So they could be getting these pressure, from the media, from the outside world, that they might have the right decision. And the media and larger forces at play are, demanding that they get to reach the right decision. And there is, of course, the threat that the DOJ, if the jury quits Rittenhouse, the DOJ may push its own charges against him. So this is just utilizing the legal system against people who, and otherwise in like 10 or 15 years ago, charges wouldn't have been pressed against them. And now we have a country where, these are individual people. Like, when you put, it's the same with judges. Like, when they put on the robe, they're still the same person. When they sit in a jury, they're still the same person. They are beholden to the same pressures and biases of any other person. They're just like you and me. And these are just, these people do fear. I mean, the fact that all these conservatives self-selected out over fears that what might happen to them if they, rule to acquit Rittenhouse, these are the things that are weighing on these people. And the same happened with the George Floyd trial and Chauvin. I think most people would agree that we would have not seen a jury convict a dude of, 3 different murder charges for the death of one person. And they did. And even when one of those charges, the Minneapolis Supreme Court now, or Minnesota Supreme Court rules that they can't file charges in that. And it's like one of the charges against him is probably going to be taken away. But they still voted guilty in all this. And because they knew the pressures. A lot of these people, all these people were from around Minnesota or Minneapolis. They saw what happened with the riots. They didn't want that to happen again. They didn't want to be threatened. They didn't want to lose their jobs. They didn't want to face this harassment. They voted the way that the powers that be wanted them to vote. And the thing is, like, I tweeted this the other day, is that you have to remember is that Antifa and BLM operate like the mafia, but in open. There are several cases of examples of where these activists go around and harass jurors and judges, and there are no real consequences for this. Like, the mafia used to do this. The mafia, of course, everyone knows this. Like, mafia would famously threaten judges. They'd threaten witnesses. They'd threaten jurors. This always happened. And we saw that as bad. But now it's seen as good to do that in these trials. There was the case even in the Chauvin trial where there was a defense witness who was called up, and these left-wing activists targeted his former home. They splattered like blood everywhere all over the house. I think it was like pig's blood of some sort. And they splattered that in a threat to this person. Now the guy no longer lives at that home, but it was the intended target. Now those people were arrested. But there is also still in Minneapolis where there's the officer who shot, Officer Kim Potter. She was the suburban Minneapolis cop who shot Dante Wright in a traffic stop, and she's on trial for that death right now. And Black Lives Matter activists led by the nephew of George Floyd went to an apartment that they thought was where the judge lived. They once again got the wrong address, and they're threatening and demanding that these things happen. I think they wanted the case recorded, or they wanted video cameras there. And also, this nephew was also saying that we need to record and take photographs of the jurors in this trial, and not only the jurors in this trial, but also the jurors in the Rittenhouse trial. And they need to know that the consequences will be had if they do not rule the correct way. And nothing has happened to that nephew. Nothing has happened to these activists. And the judge submitted to their demands in that. Now, in the Rittenhouse case, we're even seeing that, where there have been examples of people trying to take photos of the jurors. Now, that's completely, off limits. But what happened is that they forced the guy, or they claimed to force the guy to delete the footage from his phone, and they admonished him. And now the judge has been really good. Judge Schroeder, everyone loves Schroeder. He's been emitting powerful boomer energy throughout the trial. He even just said, like, we're going to warn again, and then the next time we're going to confiscate your phone. But you're not going to have to confiscate that phone the first time, because people are going to continue to do this. Like, there is that type of pressure, and they know that you can utilize this in any case, because they can operate as the mafia out in the open. They have the moral support of the system. Their pressure and harassment campaigns are not considered pressure and harassment campaigns. It's just standing up for the truth and standing up for what's right. And what they do is necessary for our society to achieve equal justice and achieve racial justice and all these good things that we talk about. And so they're given carte blanche to do whatever they want. And that's the same when it comes with this whole trial around Rittenhouse. There is no, among the prosecution and among those people who want Rittenhouse convicted, there is no awareness or acknowledgement of the violent mob. There is no acknowledgement of that. The mob is seen as a natural force that you cannot impede, that they must be allowed to do whatever they want. They must be allowed to burn down every building they want, to attack and harass whoever they want, and the only thing you can do is retreat or surrender. There are no options of self-defense. That is what this case is about, is that you have no claim to self-defense when you're facing off a mob supported by the system, that's what happened in Kenosha, that's what happened in Minneapolis, that's happened throughout the country during the BLM riots of the summer 2020. You have no claim to self-defense. That is what the trial is arguing, and that's what the prosecution is arguing, and that's what a conviction would mean against Kyle Rittenhouse if one is passed down. On the flip side, the left keeps saying that an acquittal will give the legal justification for right-wing vigilantes to go out and kill and attack peaceful demonstrators everywhere in the country, which is not the case at all. I think what the main message of this is, you're going to have to go through a horrific trial ordeal just to reach a not guilty verdict for the crime of self-defense. And there are still several people who've been charged with similar crimes. There's Jake Gardner in Omaha, Nebraska, who had shot a guy who was trying to attack his restaurant or attack his bar, and he was a part of a mob, and he was physically assaulted, and he used a gun in self-defense, and he killed him. And a few months later, under pressure, the city pressed charges against him, and he then, at the despair of what he faced ahead of him, he killed himself because, it's very tough. Without Rittenhouse, the incredible amount of financial support for Rittenhouse could be facing life in jail, without the good legal support he's had. And that's the same with anybody else. It's legal fees are a lot of money. In order to defend yourself in court, you're going to have to spend at least six figures, if not more, to get the quality legal help you need. And a lot of people, they don't have those resources. I mean, Rittenhouse has been fortunate to get those resources, but I mean, there's been some major hurdles for Rittenhouse to get there. I mean, he was kicked off of GoFundMe and other places, and they figured out a way to get him the help he needs. But not everybody can get that help. And then there's the case in Austin where there was a soldier who, these Antifa and BLM were blocking the road. And they had armed people there who were serving as, these are checkpoints. These are manned checkpoints by Antifa and BLM. And those happen throughout the country, most famously in Chaz and are in Seattle, which I'll bring that up a case there in a moment. But this happened, and then there's been no criminal charges passed against these armed guys who were, loaded up and ready to fire at people. That's just normal. You just need to deal with that. And this guy, armed with I think an AR-15 or some other form of rifle, goes up to his car door and is threatening the guy, and then the guy shoots him. And it's like, because this guy's threatening me. And for many time, prosecutors didn't press charges because he had a legal claim to self-defense. Well, just recently, that guy was pressed with charges. And, Texas isn't really coming to help him. And there are done tons and tons of other cases. There was a Minneapolis store owner who shot a guy who was looting a store, a mob. And then, that shooting prevented them from looting a store. Then police arrested him. And then, of course, the looters then looted his entire store. They eventually dropped charges, but it was like a year. It was several months later. And so that, accrues like legal charges, legal costs. You get doxxed, you can get harassed. Like there is an acquittal would definitely not send that message to America, because I mean, it ignores the massive cost of a trial. It's the real message of Rittenhouse is that, the system is not going to tolerate people defending themselves against these mobs that are supported by the system. The system will do everything possible to coddle and support the mobs, and they can do as much violence as they want. They can do literally whatever they want, and there will be no punishments for them. You can even see that in the Chaz situation, as I was about to bring up. Chaz's security killed a 16-year-old black kid and severely wounded a 14-year-old. There are competing notions of who these people were who opened fire, so I don't want to say who opened fire on them, but it was clearly it was Chaz's security. They bragged about it. They said these guys were fash, that these were alt-right white supremacists come and threatening their community. It was just black teenagers driving around in a car, and they executed them. And there have been no charges in that case. And this happened in June of 2020. No charges whatsoever. And law enforcement likely knows who did this. And the family, the families of the two teenagers who were, killed or wounded in this have demanded answers. And yet Seattle does nothing. They do nothing against these guys. And this is the same that's happened in Portland when, these guys were throwing Molotov cocktails and threatening a federal government building. And, we see it January 6th where it's like, you can't attack our system of government and we're going to come down hard on you. And now they're giving guys, they're wanting to give the QAnon shaman 4 years in jail for walking around the Capitol without permission. There's been other guys who've been getting 2 or 3 years for the same amount of crime. And yet they've been dropping charges or giving suspended sentences or just giving probation to guys who they caught throwing Molotov cocktails at a federal government building or attacking federal government police officers who are there guarding it. Drop charges, and most of the people have seen charges dropped who were arrested during those riots. And this carries on, this continues on. And there's even a case where, one of these guys who was serving armed checkpoints shot at somebody for one of these riots. And once again, they gave him a very light sentence. There's even a case it was in Minneapolis where a black guy shot at police officers before they had fired at him. And he realized that, it was a police, or he claims that he didn't know it was a police vehicle. And this guy was acquitted. They gave him self-defense charges. And of course, he's black. And so they're giving the case of where, if you have the right beliefs or the right skin color, you can basically do whatever you want. And they have always been this case where these liberals say, if this was a black Kyle Rittenhouse, he would be dead. If he was an Arab Kyle Rittenhouse, he'd be in Gitmo and stuff. And it's like, that's not actually true. We have plenty of cases of just from these people involved in Antifa and BLM riots who've had their charges dropped or been acquitted of firing at police officers for no good reason. And there's even cases, I always bring this case up from South Carolina, which this happened in 2017, but the court case was just ruled in this year, is that a black guy shot and killed a 77-year-old retired fire chief, a volunteer fire chief who was also a deacon in his church. And this happened in like 9 a.m. on an August day. Like, this is bright as sun. Like, you cannot, like, you can see what's going on. This is this is not even the middle of the day. This is bright and early morning. And he went up to this guy's truck. The prosecutors claimed that he was looking to steal it, but the defense is like, oh, he's just asking directions or whatever. And he felt that the 77-year-old startled him, and then he lit him up and killed him, and he was found not guilty. So actually, if the black Kyle Rittenhouse wouldn't have been charged at all, it's like they may have even given him a medal or some sort. I mean, or even the argument that if this had been a black conservative who had shot Antifa people, like there'd be a different response from conservatives. Actually, conservatives would be even more supportive of this guy because there's now even some rumblings about Rittenhouse among conservative media. There's a lot of conservative commentators who keep saying, like, this guy's an idiot. He's no hero. I don't like Rittenhouse, but he's not guilty. And they're continuing to make this point. And I think everyone could agree is that, you really can't do what Rittenhouse. I mean, that is like the clear message. It's like you cannot do what Rittenhouse did. You can't even confront people unarmed, as we saw in the case of the South Carolina drill sergeant. I think Sergeant Pentland was his name, who confronted a black kid in his neighborhood. I mean, I say this guy's a kid, but he's like 19 or 20. He's a legal adult. And this guy had continually harassed and sexually harassed several people in the neighborhood, had been making threats, and he had been called out because he had been threatening another woman and chasing after her. And this man posed a danger to or a threat to Pentland's own family, and Pentland simply confronted him, told him to walk away, and screamed at him like a drill sergeant, and like just shoved him like slightly, and this guy faced criminal charges for that. And he had his life ruined. Like, he was suspended from the army. He had his mob came and, started throwing rocks through his window and started harassing his family. And forever he's going to be known as this evil racist, even though the whole neighborhood is like, no, he did the right thing because this guy for a whole week had been harassing and terrorizing the neighborhood and threatening people and trying to run away with people's kids. And this guy came out there and set him straight, and he's convicted of that. So you really can't even confront people without a gun. But like, even with a gun, it's like it makes it even far worse. So that's like the message of this. And we can all agree that like Rittenhouse, you can't. It's dumb to do that now because we see the consequences, but it's like saying like the kid is in the fight for his life and it's like really wrong what he, this is outrageous. Why would anyone defend him or see him as a hero? And it's like, well, yeah, it's like you probably would not recommend to do what Rittenhouse did, but like the thing you have to say is like going off and like saying he was wrong, but he's an idiot, but he's still not guilty. There's no point to that. And it's like what he did in that situation was necessary to protect his life. And we ultimately think like what those guys were going in and doing was they were seeing all these businesses being torched, and they're like, okay, well, we're going to go in there and, as a show of force to protect these businesses from getting torched. That's show being a good member of your community. You're caring about it. And the people who's like say he crossed state lines is like Rittenhouse has family in Kenosha. He's had long ties to Kenosha. He's like 20 or 30 minutes away. He's a part of the community, and he was just there doing what you would want people to do because law enforcement wasn't going to protect these businesses. So who else was going to protect them? And they were just supposed to sit there, not use their weapons, just as a show of force to protect these businesses. And that's what many of these things. It's same with the Sergeant Pentland case. He was just there to protect his neighborhood and his community, and he was punished for it. It's the same with like Jake Carter, who is just not only just protecting his bar, he's literally protecting his life because they began threatening and attacking him when he used his firearm. And like, you're not allowed to do that. You're just allowed, as the prosecution has made clear in its arguments, Rittenhouse was supposed to allow the mob to beat him to death. Like that's what he was supposed to do, and that's the only way he could have avoided charges. So that's not the message of this of the trial at all. But there's no reason to condemn Rittenhouse. I mean, Rittenhouse is a 17-year-old. Yeah, but he didn't go there with the intended purpose of shooting people. He just went there because he's like, all these other guys are going there to protect these businesses, and we're going there just to protect businesses. We're not aiming to use our weapons. We're even offering to administer first aid to people for that. And there are even prosecutions like, you lied about being an EMT. Okay, well, he also did have like first aid training. And wouldn't you like to have a guy with first aid training in a violent situation like that? And now liberals are saying that like they should pass laws that you have no right to defense if you bring some sort of weapon to an area where you know there's going to be violence. Which, once again, this is like the Rioters Protection Act. That would what it'd be. Is like rioters are just allowed to do violence as much as possible, and citizens are just supposed to hunker down in their homes and hope that they do not. And police officers can't do anything either, because there's been police officers who've been fired or charged with crimes for using excessive force against these rioters during the George Floyd riots. And like, very few people have faced any felony charges for rioting or violence in these Floyd outbursts or in the Jacob Blake outbursts. Like, I don't think there's a single person who's faced felony charges in the Kenosha riots. I think the only besides Kyle Rittenhouse, that's it. Like, everyone else was just let off or given a misdemeanor or charges dropped. And it appears that the Kenosha authorities don't really care about riots. They just care about Rittenhouse and those who may use self-defense to protect themselves. Now, there's another case going on that's very similar to Rittenhouse that I want to talk about, but I'm going to use this as a springboard because somebody asked in one of the Cognitive Elite questions, and as a reminder, you too can get the power to ask me questions or suggest guests and topics if you sign up for the Cognitive Elite option at Highly Respected's Substack. That's at highly-respected.substack.com. So I got a Cognitive Elite question that deals with the Arbery trial, where this one comes from Dave, and he asks, he was wondering why there seems to be more coverage of Rittenhouse rather than Arbery, the Ahmaud Arbery trial. Like, what explains that? Why does the media seem more focused on Rittenhouse rather than the Arbery trial? Which there are some pretty legit reasons why that's happening. But to go back, some people may wonder what was the Ahmaud Arbery trial. If you guys remember from spring of 2020, that's the black jogger trial where the guy claimed he was jogging around his neighborhood. It's not his neighborhood. His neighborhood, he was like several miles away. And two white guys, father and son, Travis and Gregory McMichael, tracked him down. They got into a altercation, and Travis McMichael fatally shot him, and ever since then it's been seen as a modern lynching, and it was a precursor to what we saw around the George Floyd trial, or the George Floyd moment, rather, more so than the trial. And the media's reaction to it, even conservatives' reaction to it, was all that these guys are guilty. There is no way to defend them. They're 100% guilty. This case is closed. And even when they released the video, because this had occurred in, I think, February 2020, and then the video was released in April 2020, if I get the timeline right. When video was released, which was supposed to exonerate these guys, their own defense team released it to show, like, hey, they didn't do nothing wrong. Look, Ahmaud Arbery initiated the fight and tried to grab Travis McMichael's weapon, and he got shot in the process. But instead had the opposite effect, where the whole media decided that this was a modern-day lynching, and charges were then pressed against them, and they even had to bring in prosecutors from outside the county to do this, and they dismissed all the prosecutors involved who had initially not wanted to press charges, and even one of the prosecutors, I think, is being charged for the failure to press charges. So there's like this whole... also the federal government role in both cases is I think it's much more obvious in the Arbery trial because the DOJ has been involved and all these powerful forces, and they're like trying to get, they eliminated a local governance of this case and instead put like outside authorities involved. As the McMichaels, or Gregory McMichael, the elder McMichael, he was a marshal of the court and he had, served papers and other things. And he, and they're connected with the local powers, and they've totally usurped that and put in people that they think will get a guilty conviction in charge of the case instead. The DOJ has indicted the McMichaels, and I think the third guy too with federal hate crime charges. And you have to remember the third guy was just following the McMichaels along. He was the one videotaping it on his car recorder, video recorder. He didn't really, and he initially was like trying to throw the McMichaels under the bus, and then they charged him with murder too, and now he's charged with federal hate crime as well. So they're much more involved in this. And the initial prosecutor is being charged within the state, not within under federal jurisdiction for impeding the law process or whatever, because they of course wanted charges. So that's much more obvious. But the federal government's had even a role in Rittenhouse where they had all this video surveillance, the FBI, and there was also, they had all this knowledge of it, and they have not cooperated at all with the defense. They've only given their evidence to the prosecutor, and they've withheld a lot of the video footage for a long time. And even the ability that I think they even had the ability to obtain phone calls and text messages from that area. And they've refused to cooperate at all with the defense, but of course they keep giving all this stuff to the prosecution because they want a guilty verdict as well. But going back to the question of why Rittenhouse is receiving more attention than Arbery, and I have to think, is like Arbery trial is not being ignored. Like the Washington Post, New York Times, all the major outlets are giving it coverage. They're just not giving, if you turn on broadcast news and the cable news networks, you're not seeing as much attention to it. I think the main reason is that the whole, conservatives and liberals have decided that these guys, McMichaels, are guilty. And so there's not really a debate over it. The only people who are really questioning this case lie on the dissident right. Like conservatives immediately declare these guys guilty. Of course, Matt Walsh and others, I think Eric Erickson and a couple of other big names, said that Ahmaud Arbery, walking around a construction site, a home under construction several times is just what normal things do, what a guy does. And they found out when in the trial that he had done that multiple times and at night, and he at one point had been at night in the middle of winter without a shirt on. And they're like, this isn't normal, right? But it's just normal guy things. He's just checking out the house, and they believe that he's a jogger in cargo shorts, well below his knees, and in shoes that appear to be like Timberlands, but definitely not jogging shoes. And in a neighborhood far away from where he lived, he was just jogging around. And there's no sidewalks in this neighborhood either, so it's not an ideal jogging place. But they all believe it. There's not this real argument going on within the mainstream media about this. Like, most conservatives accept the premise of what the liberal media is saying, and so there's not really much of a debate over it. So they really want cases where there is a much bigger debate, especially going on with mainstream discourse over whether there's guilty or not guilty. And with Arbery, both sides have just decided that the guys are guilty and they're racist and we're not going to defend them. So there's not really that element in play here. While in Rittenhouse, there is that play. There are two sides that are firmly committed in their position, and they're vigorously debating this case. And that's what makes for better coverage, or much more interest in the coverage. I also think that it's like the Rittenhouse case has stayed in the public mind for a much longer period. Like Arbery case, after George Floyd, it kind of disappeared. I mean, there's so many other cases that there's so many cases like Arbery that they've just decided to pick up, as like the Dante Wright case that I mentioned earlier. There was a guy who was shot in Atlanta who turned out to be a gang member who was fighting with police officers. and they, I think Rayshard Brooks was his name. And they initially charged the cops with the crime, but then they dropped the charges. There's been so many cases like that it's not unique. But the Rittenhouse, this is a very unique case. They have charged with other people, but it's not has been as high profile, and this is like the case of the century. Like there's all this drama going on when they have the television screens on. They can see like this witness says something that wasn't expected. This causes a lot of attention and discussion, and conservatives want to talk about it a lot. A lot of it's also driven by conservative media interests. Is that conservative media has, they understand their audience sees Rittenhouse as a folk hero, and they want conservative media to defend him, and they love citing this as like, look at what the prosecution, or look at what the witnesses are saying. This totally debunks the prosecution. Like this thing you didn't expect to happen. Now the truth emerges. And that happens day in and day out. And there are some things going on with Arbery that, contradict the media narrative, but conservatives are much less comfortable with discussing it. And the mainstream media, they're still covering the case, but there's not like an opposite side that is interested in promoting an alternative way of viewing it. There's outside the distant right, and much of our attention is now drawn to the Rittenhouse case because it's much more exciting to watch. Like there's much more drama going on in the court case. They have all these interesting characters now set up in the case with like Binger. Everyone hates Binger. The defense attorneys are presenting themselves as interesting personalities. The judge is of course a very interesting personality. And they have all the, great Gage Grosskreuz's testimony was very compelling TV, which you don't seem to have those elements at play yet in the Arbery case. And also differences like with Rittenhouse. Rittenhouse comes off as a much more sympathetic character because he looks like a little kid, while the guys charged in Arbery's death look like rednecks from central casting of a movie about a lynching. Unfortunately, I mean, there are just like good old boys, but if that's like the thing, they look like good old boys, and that makes it harder for conservatives to want to defend them because they really want to avoid being called racist. And now it's gotten to the point where conservatives are trying to shame liberals for their failure to uphold racial justice by not focusing enough on Arbery. There was a lot of conservatives, I think Red Stephen Miller, and some other people were now like saying like, it's a shame liberals are not talking about Ahmaud Arbery, which is about racial justice. An evil white man shot an innocent black jogger in cold blood, and instead they're focusing on Rittenhouse, where Rittenhouse is a white guy who shot 3 other people who were definitely not people of color. So there's no racial element here, and the fact that they're focused on Rittenhouse shows that they're not really committed to racial justice, and it's like just stupid, like Democrats are real racist tier arguments. And it's like dumb. But I think with like McMichael's, like I don't think, it's not as, it's very similar to Rittenhouse in that there's a media narrative out there that, and already what we're seeing in the trial is that there's a different version emerging that is more aligned with reality, and they still may be acquitted for that crime because in a lot of ways, like Travis McMichael does have he is arguing on the grounds of self-defense. Like this guy, they're trying to claim Arbery initiated the fight. He grabbed the weapon. That's what happens. We'll see how the court plays out. But it's like, I don't think, deciding that this is one form is guilty, you're caving into the Black Lives Matter mob. I mean, the only reason that this went to trial is over the media pressure that occurred when the video emerged. And also there's witnesses who are even lying about their story, like the owner of the home, which Arbery was rummaging through. He, completely changed his story because he's worried about like him becoming a target or him facing a lawsuit. And he's like, oh yes, these McMichaels, they're such evil racists, even though he had been talking with them about like, there's a lot of break-ins. Can you keep an eye on this house? And so had all their neighbors too. As in the third guy who's charged with the murder initially was trying to throw the McMichaels under the bus. So there's there's a lack of loyalty going on in this case, but it's showing this like fear and pressure that they feel from that they know that BLM and Antifa now can do whatever they want, and they'll be harassed and their lives are ruined unless they say what BLM wants them to say. And jurors said this in the McMichael case too, is that they're worried about their ruling and what may happen to them if they vote the wrong way. And I think the Rittenhouse jurors also face that problem. Ultimately, I think it's wrong for conservatives to separate and differentiate the Arbery case from Rittenhouse. A lot of similar things going on. The only difference is that Rittenhouse shot people who are definitely not POC. Arbery, on the other hand, is being turned into another one of these like Trayvon Martins and George Floyd's. And he's shot by unlike in Trayvon Martin case where he's shot by a white Hispanic George Zimmerman, he is shot by the type of people that liberals want as like their cast of villains. And, it makes it harder and much less comfortable for them. But, you have to look at this. This is, once again, these guys were out there looking for their community. Maybe they used excessive force, but that's for the court of law that's for the courts to decide. That's for our justice system to decide. But you have to look is that all these cases are leading to the point that, middle Americans shouldn't defend their homes. They shouldn't defend their communities. That if a threat is going around, whether it be an armed robber and that's one of the things you have to remember is that in this case with Arbery is that Travis McMichael claims that he had interacted with Arbery before. He was like going around the neighborhood in a house, and he's like, he saw the guy come out and he thought he was armed, and he retreated because he was not armed. And when they saw him again, he apparently had asked law enforcement for advice, and they're like, make sure you're armed again the next time you see him. That's what he claims in court. So, but now it's like you shouldn't be armed at all. You shouldn't look at somebody who may be robbing your neighbor's home. The only thing you can do is just sit. Make sure, and you shouldn't call the cops on them either, because they're also trying to criminalize you calling the cops on blacks. There's several cities and states that have looked into this. San Francisco has looked into this where they, blacks can file, or people of color can file, POC can file cases in civil court if they feel that they were had the police wrongly called on them. And there's a couple other places too where it's the same. It's like it's illegal now to call the police on POC. And so the real message of all this is just to sit at home and hope that they don't break into your home and kill you or do terrible things to you. And if you see like your community being burnt, the only thing you do is retreat and say, it's none of my business. So it's really atomizing us and making us more defenseless and more helpless in the face of these mobs that are protected and facilitated by the state, by the powers that be. And if you pay attention to the news, you would think that these are an extension of the government because of how much protections they're awarded and given. And how they face no type of punishment at all. As like Andy Woe shows in all of his tweets, he was like, this serial rioter was arrested for like the 12th time and once again let off. And so there are no real punishments for these people. The only punishments happen for conservative middle Americans. I guess the best way to conclude is to answer the question that Dave asked. Of course, I think it's like to summarize or to conclude. I think the factors are, one, there's not much debate over it, at least in mainstream discourse. It's only limited to the dissident right that disagrees with the mainstream media's assessment, and and conservative media is driving a lot of the interest in Rittenhouse because their audience is really into it. They see themselves in Rittenhouse. And I think that a lot of them have forgotten about the McMichaels, and they're much less comfortable with this story of a white guy's killing a black guy, and there's a degree of discomfort with that, which they have much more comfort with. They're going to be much more supportive of this kid who shot 3 Antifa members, and many of them who had criminal records as well. It's just a story that they're going to pay much more attention to and have much more support for the guy who's on trial for. So those are the factors for why I believe the Rittenhouse trial is receiving more attention than the Arbery trial. But that could really change when the Rittenhouse trial wraps up and media then has a field day with the Arbery trial. We'll see. Now shifting gears to a different subject. It's actually the field of election politics and what's going to happen in 2024, or what may be the future of the GOP. I've discussed this a lot, but there was a story last week that deals with a lot of the things I've talked about in previous podcasts. Donald Trump is reportedly upset with Ron DeSantis not officially ruling out not running in 2024 if Trump runs. And he's apparently very upset about this. And he's talking to reporters about how he's upset about this. And this is upset Populist Inc. to a great extent. And once again is reviving all these takes that had happened when Youngkin won his race 2 weeks ago. They're now once again bringing back it's Trump is done. Trump, move out of the way. We're building a better party without you. We're all behind DeSantis and things. So I have to reiterate my arguments once again because this is not now a news story. It's much more. It's at a fever pitch now with everyone insisting that Trump is no longer the leader. We're moving on beyond Trump. DeSantis is the guy. This is what we're all about now. So in fear, with the danger of me repeating myself, I'm going to have to repeat myself about Trump versus DeSantis. All the arguments against Trump, you have to consider is Trump wants to run again. The only reasons that he would not run again are is he has a serious health emergency that prevents him from running, or he gets arrested and incarcerated. But even the arrest and incarceration may make him a more viable political candidate because that'll make him more of a martyr to his supporters, and he may run for a jail cell. I don't know. We'll see how that works out. But those are the only two things that are going to prevent him from running. There's a third that he may be worried that all of his financial wealth will disappear if he runs again. But I don't think that would happen. I think that's like a possibility that's not likely to happen. But the first two, those are likely to happen. I mean, you're in your mid-70s. You can have health emergencies that prevent you from living the life you had before. This happens all the time. It's the same with like what could happen with Biden. I mean, Biden is even older than Trump. And something very bad could happen to him health-wise that could prevent him from running again or acting as president. But it seems like he's not capable of operating as president as is, so we don't have to see what happens. But those are the only two reasons why. And with his electability problems, like everyone complains, like he can't elect, and it's always like he says mean things. Like, it's like these populist types who are like, we want our dictator, we want the real dictator, and Trump wasn't that. And then it's like, well, we can't have Trump because he'll say mean things, and that's not electable. And it's like, well, what are you looking for? And Trump has a level of charisma and connection with his base and audience that nobody can replicate. Like, there are no real challengers to Trump that have the charisma level that he has or that connection with the base that he has. All these, especially with DeSantis, as I always, I don't hate DeSantis, but I do hate the cult around him that imagines him as the future Caudillo, that he's just going to like shut down every newspaper and arrest all libtards and institute, a permanent base martial law. And like, he's also got to take down corporations and institute like a base socialism or whatever they want. And this is Ron DeSantis we're talking about. And you also say, like, DeSantis is, like, for politicians, he's okay. But, like, compared to Trump, like, he imitates Trump. Part of his popularity is how much he resembles Trump. He even uses the same hand gestures, uses the exact same hand gestures, and a lot of the other mannerisms of Trump. The difference is he can't come up with jokes on his own. He has to look down at his note cards for the good hit, and he reads it, and then he expects like a laugh, and it's just like not inspiring. Even though all these people are just trying to make believe that this is just as awesome as Trump, and it's not. DeSantis also, in terms of like being a threat to the system, is like the fact that like the Atlantic Bill Kristol, David Frum, and all these people are like open to a DeSantis run. It's like, well, it's a return to normalcy. And that's really what DeSantis represents. It represents like the normal Republican Party, the normal conservative movement, adopting some Trump mannerisms, adopting some of the things, Trumpian policies, and then returning us to normal. That's what Ron DeSantis represents. And Ron DeSantis, the globalist American empire does not view him as a threat. Like the deep state and military-industrial complex are not going to view him as a threat. They know he's going to be more on their side than Trump because Trump is a wild card. The one thing about Trump is like Trump, we all know, didn't govern the best he could. He made a lot of mistakes. I and others criticized him thoroughly when he was in office. We don't need to belabor that point. But we have to say this, like Trump has really good instincts. The problem is he doesn't always follow these instincts, or in some ways these instincts can be manipulated to do bad things. But when it comes to foreign policy, his instincts are very good. When it comes to immigration, they're very good. When it comes to like identity and racial and cultural issues, they're generally very good. And he is willing to say things in office or pursue policies in office that no one else is going to pursue. And DeSantis is going to run a standard Republican administration, staffed with standard Republican people. There will be some, like, maybe we'll get mandatory e-verify. Maybe that's basically all we can hope for. And maybe we'll get a border wall, but he's not going to want to restrict legal immigration. And people criticize Trump for this, but Trump did, through executive policy, significantly decrease legal immigration. They had a graph where immigration was cut by significant margins from 2016 to now. And it's not all COVID. Like it was going down in 2017 and 2018, long before COVID. So it's not all due to the lockdowns and the virus. Like it was already happening, occurring under Trump. There was a Trump effect, both just in his personality and the fear that he was anti-migrant, and also in the policies he pursued through executive action. He did this. DeSantis isn't going to pursue like illegal immigration restrictions because, as governor of Florida, his power base supports legal immigration. Like the Cubans and the various other Hispanics that are there that are Republican generally are in favor of immigration, especially when it comes to their people, especially when it comes to refugees. And he is going to be less willing to resist that than Trump. Trump also listens to these people, but Trump, he's not beholden to them. DeSantis is much more beholden to them. And, even with foreign policy, I think he would be a much more of a return to, GOP normalcy. And yes, we all know Trump failed in some of the things in foreign policy, but his instincts were ultimately good when it came to foreign policy. The problem is his advice wasn't good. And with DeSantis, he's just a politician. He doesn't have instincts or whatever. It's just shaped by what he thinks is going to get him elected or be politically popular. And he's going to rely far more on the advice of the foreign policy blob than Trump would, because Trump, these people would recommend him stuff, but he's like, I think this is stupid. Like, why are we staying in Afghanistan and stuff? And like, of course, he didn't get us out of Afghanistan, but as I said in podcasts about Afghanistan, he couldn't have gotten us out. He would have been overthrown if he had gotten us out of Afghanistan, because the same thing would have happened as it happened with Biden. But Biden had the clout and among media and within his own party to ensure that the withdrawal was carried out. Trump didn't have that with his party. He certainly didn't have that with the media. I think he would have been actually removed from office. Not only impeached, but removed. That's a digression, but I think it's just, comparing the two, it's like you have to look at what the system views as a threat. They view Trump as a threat. They do not view Ron DeSantis as a threat. They're never going to view Ron DeSantis as a threat. And any of these things, like he's competent and gets things done, it's like, well, what things has he gotten done in Florida? He has an overwhelming Republican legislator. He can do whatever he wants. But it's like, okay, you got E-Verify in the state. That's good, but can he do that in a national government? Maybe not. And it's like people just imagine he could do the impossible. But look at his tech censorship bill. First off, it didn't do anything. It was toothless from the start. And from what I hear from sources is that his people were, they were told like, hey, this may still allow for the restriction of hate speech, like, and anti-Semitism and stuff, and like you're still allowing these tech platforms to carve out like exceptions where they can restrict hate speech, and they're like, yeah, we're fine with that. We're fine with that. That's like, okay, we actually want big tech to prevent criticism of anti-Israel stuff. And this is what I've heard. So, I mean, this is unconfirmed reports, but this is just what I've heard from people who've interacted with DeSantis' people around that. And that's what he would do with big tech censorship. It would be toothless. And anyway, it got thrown out of court. Had they filed a follow-up? Have they tried to challenge it? No, it was just a PR move, and it even before it was thrown out, it didn't do anything. And I think that's very typical of DeSantis. And the things people have to realize is that Trump's wants to run. If he runs, he's going to win the nomination. And the chief problem with Trump running again has nothing to do with his electability, has nothing to do with what he failed to do, allegedly or actually failed to do in office. It all comes down to the fact that the system views him as a threat and they want to deplatform him and censor him. And it's going to be very tough for a presidential candidate to win an election if he's banned from every social media platform, if TV networks refuse to run his ads because he violated our democracy's terms of service, or, and venues refuse to host him because he once again violated our democracy's terms of service. So that's the real problem with Trump running again. And I don't think the answer to that is like, well, let's get somebody the system approves. I think it's, you want to change the system. You want to send a message to the system. And there is no better message to send to the system than for Trump to run and win again. All else besides that doesn't matter. It's like, if you really care about bringing down the globalist American empire and radically reshaping the regime, you have to back Trump. Everyone else is just return to normalcy and an acceptance of the new norm that has been imposed by the Biden regime. That's actually something that really be important, because it's not a rewind to pre-Trump or anything. It's just accepting the new normal that's been instituted after January 6th and the inauguration of Biden, and saying, like, we agree to these terms and we're going to follow them, and please don't ban us from social media platform. Please allow us to run ads on TV networks. We hope that we comply with your terms and you move along. So, and if DeSantis runs against Trump, he's going to get destroyed, as is everyone else. I mean, there's like suggesting such ridiculous candidates. Like Matt Lewis, who is, I worked with a caller. He's a complete idiot. He has never had an interesting take in his life, yet he's somehow had a career off of political takes. Had an article saying that Liz Cheney and Chris Christie, remember Chris Christie, are going to give Trump a run for his money in 2024 and could really challenge him in a primary. It's like, with who? Like, there is no base of support for either candidate. Chris Christie has already ran for president back when he had a better shot at it, and he got no support. And just imagine, like, 8 years later, when everyone's forgotten about him and they view him as a laughingstock, now coming back and trying to run against Trump. It's a laughable matter. I mean, and there's other people who want to run, like Pompeo and others. I think DeSantis is smart enough to not run if Trump runs. But there are a lot of other people who are not as smart. And I think Pompeo seems more eager to do this. Pompeo will get destroyed. Christie will get destroyed. Cheney, of course, will be destroyed. You just have to face it. Like, Trump's going to be the nominee, and complaining about this stuff is not going to get your way. And imagining, other candidates as the ideal populist who fixes all of Trump's errors and is going to be this, strong man of your dreams, is just that person doesn't exist. It definitely doesn't exist with DeSantis. It doesn't exist with Josh Hawley or whoever else people want to suggest. The closest person to that is still, for ideal leader, shakes up the system, who's going to lead to radical change, it's still Donald J. Trump. Whether we like it or not, of course, we know that Trump's not perfect. There are many imperfections with him. But the meta-political significance of him running again and having the chance to win is the main reason to support him. And so, and if he runs, he wins the primary. So People are just going to have to get used to that. And I think people are being stupid in betting on Desantis or whoever is thinking that their odds are better with Desantis. And one funny thing is I think Populist Inc. could turn into Never Trump of 2024. And they're going to be hysteric and treating Trump like a jilted lover and being really scornful of everything he says and stuff. You could see that the potentiality for that. But the one thing to realize is Populist Inc. is incredibly opportunistic. So once they realize that Trump has secured the nomination, all these people are bashing him right now and saying it's time for him to move off. Like, I hate Trump. They're all going to be turned into Trump cheerleaders by the time they realize that he secured the nomination. A much more dramatic transformation, a sudden transformation than what happened with Never Trumpers. Because a lot of these conservative ink types, they had some principles. I mean, they're stupid principles, and they're also opportunistic. But nobody's more opportunistic than most of the people who are guiding Populist Inc. Most of these people were Never Trumpers, well into the Trump administration, and now they pretend that they're always Trump supporters, and they really understand Trumpism and national populism, even though they were calling it white nationalism, white supremacy in like 2017 and 2018. So these people will get in line, but it'll be interesting to see how Populist Inc. reacts to Trump running again, and briefly being Never Trump, the Never Trumpers of 2024. Maybe some of them will ally with Bill Kristol. We'll have to see. On our final topic today, moving along, this is going along with the political angle. I think the final nail in the base unions meme has finally been planted. I think that nothing can ever disabuse Populist Inc. and other right-wingers of thinking that unions are base, but hopefully this will get them to reconsider. 3 of the biggest unions in the country, the AFL-CIO, which is a trade association which represents most unions, the United Food and Commercial Workers Union, and the SEIU, which represents a lot of public sector unions or union workers, they have all come together to demand they're suing the Biden administration over the vaccine mandates, not because they're invasive or that the vaccine mandates go too far, but because they don't go far enough. They want it expanded to small businesses and all businesses, that they must all require vaccine mandates to work. And this is the way to protect workers. So there have been a lot of workers, especially in the blue collar fields. And I've talked about this previously in the podcast, where it's becoming a class signifier of whether you have a vaccine or not. And there's tons and tons of blue collar workers, especially in trucking, law enforcement, other places where they're refusing to get the vaccine, a significant number of them. And there could be real problems for our economy if then they implement the mandate and these guys, these people are laid off. We already have a labor shortage now. Imagine that if they actually went full bore with the vaccine mandate. But these unions, which represent pretty much nearly the entirety of organized labor. I mean, most unions are a member of the AFL-CIO. The United Food and Commercial Workers Union represents most people who work in the food industry, and the SEIU represents a ton of public sector workers and private sector workers as well. These people are usually the SEIU represents the service industry. That's why service is in the name. They are all now not only supportive of the mandates, but they want them to go further. They want them to be expanded and be stricter. So I have to say, this is organized labor occurring here. And people all want to say, no, we can't be anti-union. No, we can't break up the unions. How dare you support right to work? No, we need to have stronger union power. And when you think about stronger union power, I now want you to think of organized labor suing the Biden administration for their vaccine mandates not going far enough. That is organized labor right there. It does not stand up for workers' rights. It does not stand up for anything that America First should support. It stands up for its own corrupt interests, and I'm tired of us dealing I'm tired of people pretending that unions are secretly based or that they can be pushed in our direction if we're nicer to them or if we get rid of right to work. No, right to work is good because it hurts union power. Unions are a hostile institution. I'm tired of people saying like you risk alienating working class people by attacking unions. Well, what do you think about us attacking universities? Like most middle class people go to universities, yet we still view them as hostile institutions. There's no reason that we should not see unions in the same way that we see universities. And that's why right to work is good, because it hurts their power and it gives workers the right to choose whether they want to be in a union or not, which usually, they don't. If they're in right to work to state, even if you don't if you oppose a union, you're in a union. Sorry, you don't get that choice. But in right to work, you do. And that does undermine their power. And generally, when unions have a lot of power, what do? They give all their money to Democratic candidates, and they support open borders. They support Black Lives Matter. They support everything and every insane thing in the left-wing coalition that we oppose. And people will still look to some 1930s union or even further back to say like, well, it was based then, it can be based again. And it's like, you don't work in a union field. You're a political commentator. Most of the people who argue for this do not work in a union field. They're not competing in these union leadership elections. There is no real plan to make unions based again except tweeting about it on Twitter. That's it. And I'm tired of hearing about this. And if you really look at this case, and there's still people replying like, well, we shouldn't alienate unions. It's like, okay, what are good about unions? Like, what are the good things that unions are supporting right now? Because everything that they're doing is terrible, and the real argument for them is to standing up for workers' rights. And a lot of workers are not wanting to get the vax or opposing the mandate. And what are unions doing? They're doing the complete opposite of that. And this is not, and none of these unions are teachers' unions either. So that's like the worst union. And the NEA, which represents most teachers, is the largest union in the country, and they're not involved in these lawsuits. And of course, they want the mandate for all kids and all teachers, etc. So, no, organized labor is once again showing its true side, and it is very opposed to our interests. And people really need to bury the base union meme. Unions are a hostile institution. We should view them in the same way you view universities. Universities are also necessary. So are unions. But that doesn't mean we need to imagine that we can turn the university's base. No, you want to limit their power and to deconstruct their ability to harm our nation. And you can rebuild them in a much more positive direction. But right now, we want to reduce their power and to go after them because they are hostile institutions to our interests and to our continued existence as a nation. And we can see this with this latest move. So I just wanted to bring that up to once again reiterate my take on unions, and to once again mock the idea that they can ever be turned base again, or this base union meme on the right wing that needs to go away. If you ever look at unions, this is what they're doing. And every day, every week provides me a new story that reaffirms my takes on unions. So that's all I want to conclude on this topic today. We'll, of course, have a great IQ supplement on the Rittenhouse trial later this week if there's a verdict reached. So be on the lookout for that. And so until next time, stay respected.